Welcome to the Rolling Forward podcast,
a platform where we talk about all things logistics.
Leading this discussion, you've got Brett and Nathan.
And together, we share a passion for the logistics industry.
All right, welcome.
Good afternoon.
We're here. And on this occasion, we're going to have to turn my head to the right and your head to the left, because for the first time, we have our first guest on the show.
That's right.
Really exciting. So welcome, Neil.
I feel very honoured. Thank you for inviting me.
You should. So Neil Chambers from Container Transport Alliance Australia, you're a great advocate for our industry, and we've had a lot of collaboration over the years. So it's really exciting to have you here for our very first.
Welcome.
I'm a fan of the podcast, and I'm really honoured.
That's the right answer.
Third-party guest.
Yep.
Very good.
Yep.
Where do I send the bill?
So, well, let's dive in and first, can you provide an introduction about yourself? And I want you to explain CTAA, the value you bring to the members and so forth. But also, I want you to link in your timeline and to got you to where you are right now.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm going to give away my age now by talking about how I started in the industry. So when I left school, I was actually going to join the army and go to Duntroon, but I was one of these babies that was always a year behind at high school. So when I graduated, I was 17 and a half, not 18 and a half. As a result, couldn't apply directly to Duntroon at the time. So, and my father, being a wartime dad, said, go out and find something to do.
Yep.
And I got involved in being a cadet in a shipping line.
Okay.
And found that I liked it. So subsequently, I scratched the itch, which was the Army through the reserve, and that actually is another part of my history. So 1978, sorry, Nathan, I am old.
That's not old, just a number.
I started as a cadet there, so some time with shipping lines, some time doing a short stint with a small international freight forwarder customs brokerage. I almost thought about becoming a licensed customs broker.
Yep. I'm sure you'd excite a lot of people now, because if I hear it's a rarity. It's not a rarity. It's more the case of there's not a lot of people coming through as customs brokers.
But, in those days, and Brett will attest to this, it was, you could do anything really in the industry, couldn't you? You could carve your own fortunes out from the industry, which leads into some stuff I'll talk about with CTAA, which I'm very passionate about, and that is people understanding the supply chain. And because when I started in the industry, I was crawling all over ships and empty container parks and right in the hub of it, whereas nowadays people get stuck behind a computer and a desk and they really don't understand where they might necessarily be within the supply chain, how it all works in reality.
Yeah. So
that was a good grounding for me. My Army, being an officer in the Army, I then did 2 years, sounds highfalutin, but I did 2 years as aide to the Governor of Victoria as a military aide. Which then led me down the path of more going into advocacy. So the majority of my time after that was really an advocacy role. So I started with what became the Australian Ship Owners Association, so representing all the Australian ship operators, be it the oil companies, Mobil, Shell, BP, BHP, bulk vessels, etc.
Yeah.
That took me off to London for 3 years in the early 90s, representing the International Chamber of Shipping, International Shipping Federation to the UN. Sounds, again, highfalutin, but, very much a policy advisory role. And I then came back to the Australian Ship Owners Association and then was invited to join the Victorian Transport Association, so the equivalent of here in Queensland, the QTA, the Queensland Trucking Association.
Yeah.
So I was 14 years at VTA, becoming deputy CEO, like yourself, mate, and then CEO for a time. But my passion was always around container supply chains, because it is the sexy part of the industry, and containers are sexy.
Yep. And it's just amazing. I think I read the stat, 90% of global trade is done through international shipping, containers.
Correct.
Just amazing.
And it's a very complex supply chain. It is probably the most complex supply chain, which leads on to some of the things we'll talk about today, because there's many stakeholders, there's regulatory requirements, there's commercial stakeholders, each of which can operate in their own silos because they've got, there's certain things driving their behaviour. And again, coming back to having an understanding of where you sit within the chain, if you understand what's driving behaviour, you might not like it, but at least you can then talk about strategies to deal with that and try to get the best efficiencies and the like. And that goes for the stevedores, that goes for empty container parks.
Yeah.
Beneficial cargo owners have got their own behaviour that is being driven, whether that's cost, whether that's, some regulatory issues. So all of this is in a very complex supply chain. And that was, again, one of the passions for developing Container Transport Alliance Australia in November 2014, because, we could see the need for an advocacy and support business that was national in its approach, probably unique in that way, so that, we could start to deal with some of these interface issues, which we all have in each of the capital city ports. The issues are the same, the characters are different, and there's some slight difference in detail, but the same concerns, same issues that you're experiencing here in Brisbane are replicated in the other ports to a degree. So having that ability to look across all the ports and deal with all governments, I think's been a benefit. Yeah. And so on the education side, as you know, because we've brought groups here to your premises, the idea of port awareness training for everybody in the industry, and we've had a lot of government people go through that because they're regulating the industry but really don't necessarily understand the detail of it. Again, what's driving behaviour.
Well, it's like what you said beforehand about, through your early years into your professional career, you got to experience a lot of things hands-on, and you got to go into different areas and whatnot. And like you said today, sometimes those opportunities aren't as available, and sometimes people do get, for lack of a better word, stuck behind a desk.
And I know you as a company, credit to you guys at SEQH, because from what I see, you do put your staff through all sorts of training. You encourage them to get truck licenses, for instance, and to have that approach is, actually refreshing, because some don't do that. You just get stuck behind the computer, and you don't know if you do something at this point in the chain, or worse still, maybe don't do something in the chain at that point in time. What's the impact on others up and down the supply chain? Have you thought about, the consequences of that action or inaction? So they've been very popular, and in a small way, hopefully that's helped people get a better understanding of how they can collaborate with other parties in the chain. Again, understanding what's driving that behaviour.
And for the context of the listeners, what we talk about here is Neil's actually running bus tours through, transport operator yards, empty container yards,
Stevedores,
into the stevedores, up certain towers.
That's right.
Off the back of a morning of discussion around all those things that we just spoke about, behaviour, how containerisation first started, how it's been a revelation. Really, it's, just over 65, 70 years of age, and it's...
Which is only really recent.
Right. Yeah.
It's only recent.
Yeah.
But it has had a dramatic effect on the efficiency of moving freight.
And I always ask, does anybody know who Malcolm McLean is? And most people don't. They know who Steve Jobs is, and they know who Bill Gates is, and they know who Elon Musk is. But someone who actually changed the face of the world is little known. And he was a truck driver. So there we have it.
The reason I know his name is through truck drivers, because there's a couple of truck driver pages that we're a part of on Facebook, and quite regularly it flows around them mentioning that do you know that this came from a truck driver? This came from a truck driver, which is fantastic. And as you said, like there's all these other names that people know so well, but albeit Mr. Malcolm, not as well known.
Not as well known.
Yet
it's a simple idea. This whole idea of standardisation. I keep saying in the courses, who invented the bottle opener? I mean, how would you be without the bottle opener? And it's a very simple tool, and so is a steel box that moves freight around on a standardised way, and every piece of equipment, whatever mode, can handle the container. Pretty good.
Yep. Awesome.
Yeah.
Great intro.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, why don't we start with one of our first discussion points surrounding the interface between landside and stevedores and waterside. And you know, we're focused very much on Queensland, Port of Brisbane, and we're really seeking some of your input here about what you're seeing across other states and the interactions between both those sides. Yeah, let's dive in.
Well, let's talk about the stevedores and perhaps also talk a little bit about terminal access fees and increasing fees, vehicle booking system fees, etc. Governments in Australia, state governments particularly, wanted competition in stevedoring, and they got it by the introduction of third stevedores at least in the East Coast ports. So Hutchison in Sydney and Brisbane, and Victoria International Container Terminal in Melbourne. Now, who's been the beneficiary of that? By and large, it's the shipping lines, the foreign shipping lines, because that has meant that there is more competition, particularly since VICT entered the market in 2016. More competition, which meant that the shipping lines had a lot of negotiating power in terms of the contracts, because they could, effectively play each other off. Stevedoring, like trucking in a way, but stevedoring is highly capital intensive activity, and you get lumpy investments. And naturally, the stevedores realised that they weren't going to get the rates of return that they expect from their business, and perhaps it's, those expectations aren't unrealistic. So they needed to look for revenue streams outside of their traditional customers, the shipping lines, because they weren't able to negotiate enough to make that return that they felt was healthy. And they could naturally turn to the landside fees. And there were small infrastructure fees, as you know, and the vehicle booking system fees were measured in dollars, not in hundreds of dollars. And they just hit on creating those increases in fees, unfettered. So no, whether governments would ever admit that perhaps they really should, along with the privatisation of ports, thought about what the unintended consequences of all of that was. But we are where we are. So but over time, and the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, does a very good report every year. They contain a monitoring report. It's well worth reading. It might put you to sleep, but it is well worth reading.
No, it's well worth reading.
Because it's the only time that the landside logistics stakeholders get a view inside, not directly, but inside what the contract arrangements are between the shipping lines and the stevedores. And if you look at it, at least since 2018-19, all of the increases in costs in the stevedores have by and large been met by increases in landside fees. So the shipping lines, I think I'll get the stats right, I'll be corrected if not, over the last decade have enjoyed about a 40% reduction in what they pay per lift, as they say in the ACCC report. Revenue per lift. And the landside has a commensurate increase. So that just means that the stevedores haven't gone back to their traditional customers. The shipping line has said, look, you're going to have to pay more per lift because we have greater expenses, labour, equipment, maintenance, energy, all of those things, because of that commerciality of the negotiation of
few versus the many. Neil, do you think that'll change over time, or what will give rise to a change there? Because it just seems like that one side's
it's balanced
weak,
more to one side.
one side's weak, one side's strong, and you just keep getting that movement in that direction.
Well, the ACCC in its latest report in December last year was the clearest they could be as a regulator with their language, and they used the term market failure, that the increases were such that, and the point that I feel that the stevedores have collected more in revenue than they would have if they were just able to levy all their revenue through the shipping line. So now the stevedores would argue that they need a healthy rate of return. It's good for Australia that you have healthy stevedoring industry. We want to encourage the foreign ships to come to Australia. Australia would be worse off if they didn't, and that's an okay argument. But there's got to be a point where there's a balance. And the ACCC has no power under the Act unless it's given that power to regulate the industry. But of course, there's more and more calls, particularly from the beneficial cargo owners and freight forwarders community, for there to be some regulatory intervention, mandatory code of practice. Each of the state governments have clearly now in their freight strategies and the like said this is a federal government issue. It's not a state government issue, even though ports are regulated by and large through states. They've said that this is because the stevedores, again, by and large, are international and national organisations, that it's the federal government that should be looking at whether there's a need for mandatory codes. What the state governments have done in conjunction with the federal government is moved to voluntary protocols for the stevedores, which they've accepted. So that gives you adequate notice, 60 days notice, 30 days final notice. And the Victorian government just had agreement from the stevedores to have one aligned date, which is the 1st of January in each calendar year. And again, Patrick and DP World have accepted that and actually then made that national across all of their terminals.
And to their credit, like, you know, they give us the 60 days notice, and that's commercially, that's very helpful.
Very helpful.
Yeah. You know, to arrange that with our own contracts and customer arrangements.
I think if you look at the returns, Neil, that they bottomed out when Hutchison and the OCT came in. And then they've basically increased pretty much since then.
Yes.
That strikes me as it end up with cosy numbers. We'll keep our market share and we won't compete for too much other market share and hence put pressure on prices. So they've all, because I think Hutchison's returns were dragging down industry rate of returns in that time.
Yeah. I think at that time, Brett, there was something like 5% of return on investment, and even you would not think that 5% is good.
No, that's right. But do you think because I think MSC is going to be taking over Hutchison Group.
Yeah, so that's a global play. Yeah.
So my question is, will that bring a shake-up of the market shares in the market here? Because it's the only thing, because if we have a market failure as the ACCC is leading to, then we either fix the market, i.e. bring in more potential competition, or there is competition, there's participants who are unhappy with their market share and then go about changing that, which is the only way you end up with, I guess, more market offerings and more different ways of doing it.
I think one of the challenges in the Port of Brisbane is that one incumbent stevedore has a fair swag of the market share.
Yes.
And Hutchison, can we say if John Willey, the CEO, was, and I speak regularly with John, he would agree that you need some investment in the Hutch terminals to really take them to the next
volume.
Yeah. And if MSC is, through their global terminal arm, is successful in taking over Hutchison, he probably sees that as a benefit because they'll finally potentially get some investment here, because you would need to invest if MSC vessels were to call it Hutch. You would need a fair amount of investment to extend the scope of the terminals, and improve the height and reach of the
cranes,
shore cranes and the like. So he probably sees that as a good thing, and that would have a shake-up because, but that's potentially years away.
Right,
4 or 5 or 6 years. I would have thought
that's a competitive response to a stagnant market share.
Absolutely. Whereas in the other ports, I mean, the Port of Melbourne, when it was just the two incumbent stevedores, it was a little bit like the two airline policy. You know, they popped the champagne corks when they got an extra couple of percent in trade. Again, it's not, you know, it's a statement of fact that DP World's terminal in Melbourne is smaller in footprint, and so if it had overly amount of market share and ship bunching and all vessel bunching, all these things that we experience day in day out, you would get a congested terminal fairly quickly, which would then translate into queues of trucks waiting to get into the terminal and poor landside productivity. So probably a good thing with VICT coming into the market is that it's almost a third now in Melbourne. So it is balanced out, which is much better for the transport industry.
And look, it's also sounds good for importers and exporters too, because ultimately, like when cargo comes in, the clock starts, and customers need their cargo promptly.
That's it.
And then similarly again, when packers have packed their export goods, they need to go. So you need these efficient terminals.
Yeah.
And you know,
and in Sydney, of course, it's different again in that the relationship between the road transport operators and the stevedores broke down to such a degree that a government regulated, you know, a decade ago or more, for the Port Botany Landside Improvement Strategy mandatory standards, the PIBLIS mandatory standards, as they talk about. What did that do? It did create an environment where truck turnaround times were relatively consistent, but there's always fors and against in being regulated as a business. I would have thought that you don't necessarily like to be regulated.
No,
no, it's forced to behave in such a way and think in a certain way and have conversations in a certain way. And like I couldn't think of anything worse.
I know, it's just so poisonous. The relationship though was
it was terrible.
It was a bad outcome.
Yeah,
because of a bad situation.
Yeah. Now look, the transport operators in Sydney would say that it's the only way that they got any form of protection from behaviour, but
it's pretty poor that it got to that point, though.
Very much.
I look at our circumstance here in Brisbane, and we can collaborate with any of those terminals and have conversations, and you know, at the end of those conversations, one party might not be happy. But most of the time, we can come up with a some sort of solution.
Of any of the ports, you have so much natural advantage here in Brisbane, and the relationships by and large are excellent. You know, it's a collaborative environment. You know, your freight miles are reduced because you're either on the island or in Hemmant and Lytton and those areas close. And I know you're setting up on Portland soon, so that's really reducing your freight miles. Good use of higher productivity freight vehicles. No concern about community backlash from operations, which Melbourne suffers from badly. So does Sydney. So does Fremantle.
Yeah.
So does Adelaide. So you know, so much natural advantage here, the ability for the port to continue to grow into Moreton Bay. You know,
it's really the leader in Australia, I would say, from that perspective.
Yeah,
it may not be the biggest in Australia.
No, well, it's not.
But the reality is that's where it potentially can lead towards. For those very reasons that geographically, it's such a fantastic position out of the road.
Yeah,
and there's opportunities to expand.
And I know you guys are passionate, which leads us to the productivity issue. It's about continuing to try and drive innovation and productivity. And I mean, you guys are leading edge as far as that's concerned. So again, you know, all strength to you. But there are some things in this state that are probably lagging now. High productivity freight vehicle access, for instance. We've got to keep having those conversations with government. You know, the whole idea of productivity stagnating in Australia generally, Brett.
It's a big topic right now.
Yeah,
it is, my word. Stop it. And I think there's going to be a summit or some damn thing that the government's convening.
Yeah, that's right. Now, whether governments understand, you know, we can do it safely, efficiently with a different vehicle design, which is not necessarily much longer than what you've currently got.
No, we've proposed vehicles that have got, existing vehicles, just loading them to their capacity to have a 6, 7, 8% increase in productivity. That's a no cost, no brain one. And then to other ones that have got a 50% improvement in productivity for, a couple of metres and compliance with PBS rules.
But
Which is just huge.
Think about it when you guys and you're in Toowoomba, in other parts of Australia, we look back and thought that is a fantastic collaboration between local government, state government and industry, because at the time you said, where is the freight task? And what have we got to do to be more productive with this freight task? And that led to, your pioneering of
the A-doubles,
of the A-doubles down the Toowoomba range. I think right across Australia and here as well, we've got to continue to have those conversations with government about what is the freight task. It's not about trucks. It's actually about being productive and, as you said, Nathan, exporters and importers.
Yeah, is to serve the business owners and ultimately the consumers of these goods. And when we talk about the Toowoomba side of things as well, that overnight had a dramatic impact on our agricultural industry in particular.
Yeah,
and those major exporters.
Well, it allowed to. We were always doing bulk, grain, and bulk commodities, but it allowed to pick off higher value, container receiving customers,
which is good for vessels, because vessels are bringing, majority of their movements are bringing import
reposition containers as well,
and now they can reposition containers with some dollars there.
Exactly. So, but it's about productivity, which leads to higher living standards.
Yes.
Leads to lower costs for people, lower costs for exporters, lower costs for importers. And the more we do it, the more competitive we are and the more productive we are, the lower those costs are and the higher people's standard of living.
And it's worth saying that you don't pocket all that productivity benefit.
No, it gets passed back.
You pass it back through to the beneficial cargo owner.
That's
particularly the commodity exporter.
That's right.
Where the landside fees are a significant component of their landed cost overseas.
Exactly.
And then
precisely.
And, just on that as well. So, we started talking about the fact that there's an imbalance between the waterside cost that gets levied and gets charged versus the landside costs. And, when we can come up with these innovative ideas to actually push the boundaries of productivity to benefit these shippers, then it potentially means it supports those matters of reducing those costs. And it might mean that they're potentially shipping more because...
That's right. Well, that's the outcome, Nate.
That's the outcome we want.
We ship more.
And I think that, coming back to the equipment issues that you mentioned before, Brett, if you've got your triaxle dolly, it's not about the triaxle dolly. It's about what's the impact on the freight task. I think that's the sort of conversation.
It's about 8% or something. It's a bit less than 10%, but it's just thrown away. It's a nonsense. It's an improvement that we should just pick up because there's no cost.
Yes.
In fact, what we do is run additional trucks to cover that lack of productivity. It's an absolute nonsense.
It's frustrating, and there's some government areas where it's really enjoyable to work with, and we had a on-road assessment recently, and that was an absolute delight working with those green peaks.
Right.
They're very much innovatively productivity focused.
Yep.
And then, dare I say, we're at another event in recent times, and we got to the end of it, and we wanted to shoot ourselves because why is this made harder than it actually should be? Seriously, and it comes back to some of the points you talked about beforehand about people getting out of their desk, and going on the field,
bunker and have a look.
Come out of the bunker and have a look and experience and maybe see things through a different lens.
Yes,
and coming back to your very good recent podcast on, lower emissions and the like, and the things you're doing with the electric trucks, and it all comes back again. Every road leads back to productivity.
Yeah,
because. As good as the electric truck might be, as you're going to integrate it into your fleet in certain tasks, it's not going to do the bulk of it. And
no, it's not.
I pulled some figures before coming here. The Truck Industry Council figures are quite sobering that by 2030, more than 80% of the truck sales will still be in diesel trucks.
Yep.
And the population of trucks by 2030 will still 97% of the trucks will still be diesel. So diesel is not going away anytime soon.
No.
So how do you start lowering emissions? And it's things that you've been doing. So it's solar and
it's per unit.
Per unit.
Per unit. Yeah.
It's route optimization. It's truck utilization. One of the issues, and we do have those conversations with the stevedores, and you guys are involved in that. The backloading rates out of the stevedore terminals are
just 8%.
Yeah, are not great.
I know ours are a lot higher than that, and we target that aggressively, and because that's just, it seems to us, as one of the very simple things, that makes sense. If you run a truck loaded one way, you might as well run it loaded the other way.
At some stage, governments are going to come a knocking and saying, "What are you doing to reduce your emissions?" And your customers will probably more and more say, "Tell me what your Scope 3 emissions are," and all these other figures. And of course, again, we rely on the operational practices of other stakeholders that you need to interact with, particularly the stevedore terminals, the empty container parks. And if they're not, encouraging and incentivising this sort of behaviour, then we've got a problem.
Yeah. So we're going down the pathway of this triple electric combination running down the island. We had our on-road assessment. We have it on tape, on recording, the approval, and we're just waiting on that officially to come through on paper. But one of the empty parks we had a trial through was very receptive in a healthy way, and we went into that conversation going, we don't want special access and special runs and special exits. We want the same access that a single trailer, an A double, or a Super V would get. And we've got to collaborate together to go, well, what will we need to do that's still in the commercial interest of that empty park to make sure that our combination can go through that whole traffic management, follow the traffic management plan as intended as well. And to the credit of that empty park, which was Cube, they were very open-minded and they recognised that, if we work on this together, SQH and Cube, there's others that will come to the party as well and can do that. And it's in the best interest of industry.
And look, we mentioned empty container parks before too. They've got the same dynamic going on with the shipping lines saying, we're not paying for anything. And so I think a component of the increase in empty container park notification fees has been driven by exactly that.
Pushback.
The pushback.
That harsh negotiation.
But again,
the one-sided, maybe the one-sided.
A few. A few have a competitive advantage too.
And I don't mind it where you get empty container parks, and there are a few in this port, but in other ports as well, where they're investing so that the truck turnaround times, we really should be achieving 5-8 minute truck turnaround times in empty container parks. There's no reason for the driver to get out of the cab of the truck to go and announce that they've arrived at an empty container park. It's the 21st century. The systems are there, and if they augment those with optical camera recognition and other ways of identifying the truck, matching the truck booking with the arrival, and if we get the proper information electronically from all the shipping lines, which is still a problem to this day, we can improve productivity. And if they're investing in better equipment, better yard planning, etc., you can justify some of the increases. But when they're just increasing because their other customer is not wanting to pay for anything, rental increases, energy increases.
The only thing I'd say, Neil, about the container parks is you or I can go, you and I can go set one up on a street corner. So there is a natural competitive element to that.
Yes.
But ultimately, I agree with you. The increase in fees has been a result of that competitive imbalance. The interesting thing then will be what the dynamics around that are in terms of lines accepting new parks, parks rebating, whatever it might be. There's all sort of range of, kicking back to shipping lines to send business to them. There's a whole bunch of stuff can go on the side, I suspect. But ultimately, there's no limit on the number of container parks.
No, which is different from the stevedoring side.
It's different to the stevedores, but
quite
competitively,
a massively significant capital they need to contribute.
That's right.
Let alone actually finding the
land.
The land.
And the landscape is changing. Medlog's an example here, but in the other ports, particularly Melbourne, there are more shipping line directly run parks.
Right.
And more they're vertically integrating into not only park operations, but also transport operations.
Yes.
stevedores. DP World's looking to try and purchase Silk. So there's vertical integration going on all over the place, which is a big shake-up, I think, for the industry in the next 5 to 10 years.
No, it is. No question. It is.
Yeah.
And it's to be seen how long that lasts and whether that potential dilution of, returns occurs from that. So whether they actually do add value, or they ultimately look back and say that was a great idea but didn't work. So,
well, it all comes back to customer service, and you guys are, you
you've got to be
understand that implicitly.
Yeah. That's the key. And ultimately, they've got to be able to provide that seamless, what we call seamless service, And if they can't provide it, then they'll lose customers, so no matter what their pricing is.
Yep.
So,
and it's interesting that the old 80-20 rule really applies. The top 30 to 40 carriers in each of the markets, road carriers, carry 80% of the TU. So there's a concentration at the top end, and then there's a whole bunch of sort of
rats and mice.
But if you can get those top 40 companies humming in each of the capital city ports, you've by and large solved your problem. And that's what we're going to continue to strive for, and that's what CTAA tries to do by having all of the transport operators in the alliance, so that we can collectively talk on behalf of you guys and try to get those changes happening.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Okay. And I think it'd be interesting talking about the topic of vertical integration and whatnot. And there was a conversation I was having with someone recently where one of these significant international companies are now running some trucks as well. And there's a massive difference between running a vessel and running trucks. Yes. And I can totally appreciate that there's a big cost difference between a vessel and a truck. So when the vessel arrives, it's like, well, stop what you're doing and serve me. And I get that, so from the interaction between the shipping line and the stevedore, I get the relationship there of I've arrived, so staff up and unload me and reload me and away I go. I get it. On the trucking side of things, it's very different. We can't necessarily dictate to our customers and say, hey, by the way, it suits us. We're coming to see you then, and make sure you're ready. We're going to drop your box, or you're going to unload us, or whatnot. That sort of dictatorship, for lack of a better word, just can't happen between road transport and the end delivery location. And I heard a story of this actually occurring between, this shipping line that sort of, got some trucks. And doing that sort of behaviour, and lo and behold, the customer says goodbye. So that's where there's got to be a separation of how they focus on that business.
Yeah,
and I'm not trying to compare the vessel to the truck, but what I do know for sure is you can't run a truck like a vessel.
No. And the successful road transport operators like you guys is you are the piggy in the middle. So you've got one eye on the discipline of the wharf, and the penalties if you're not in time, all of those things, and when the box is available, when the export cutoff is going to occur versus your customer needs. And I mean, that has changed dramatically over the years as well, the staging of boxes back through yards, and
which is mandatory. Like I couldn't imagine running things without a yard, and we don't like the charges or the harshness or the penalties of the stevedores in that regard, but I also can appreciate where they come from, because if they don't play that hard line and people abuse it, then all of a sudden they overflow with containers, and it just does not work. They can't work in their environment. They need to have containers. Like, it's almost like when we've had weather events and the stevedores have said no more reefers or no more exports.
That's right.
It hurts everyone further up the chain, but I get it. Like, there's only so much they can actually house down to stevedore, at the terminal. And they've got to play that hard.
You're scrambling for reefers plug-in points to
deal with all the reefers that keep coming, and we can't get it.
The difference there is that we've engaged with those clients, versus the stevedores that, they're receiving thousands of containers.
So running
for multiple vessels.
Running a successful container road transport operation is really difficult. And to take your point, that shipping lines or others that might want to get into it, if they don't understand that, and there's been examples of that over history, even other road transport operators that have never been in containerisation, for example, haven't been able to make it work. General freight or line haul guys going in.
Yeah, it is a complicated business.
As you say, Brett, you've got this thing called the empty. It's just,
You've got to deal
Yeah.
with it.
yeah,
Yeah, you forget about that, and
that's
it
right.
costs you more than the job.
Route.
Don't forget about that.
That's right.
Absolutely about that. So I guess are there any, just to end on the productivity side of things, is there any free advice you want to leave to go, this is what you think Queensland should be focusing on, or this is what Queensland is short on compared to what you're seeing in some of the other states with an uptake of productivity?
Well, I think Queensland, as I said before, you were leading with this idea of high productivity freight vehicles outside of the port precinct, really driving productivity again on specific freight routes. We've got to get back to that. Victoria, you can operate up to 35.5 metres in length.
Right.
But the debate is always with government. In Melbourne, for instance, they're about to open what's called the Westgate Tunnel Project, so an upgrade of the M1 route in from the west and a new tunnel arrangement to get to the Swanson Dock precinct of the port. That's all well and good, but they haven't necessarily upgraded all of the culverts and the bridge structures and other things that are running in from the Western District or other. So it comes back to, we've got to get back to government, sit down and say, now, where is the cotton coming from? Where is the grain coming from? Where is the meat coming from?
Yep.
It's not about the truck. It's about how are we going to make this work and be productive. And as you said,
Where's the customer?
Where's the customer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep the customer focused, keep the customer in mind. And
And again, in other ports, there's some, an increase in rail operations, difficult in the Port of Brisbane. Very small percent, the smallest percentage probably of any of the ports in terms of rail.
It's down to like 2% now.
But it flows off people's tongues. To reduce carbon emissions, we've got to get more freight on rail. It's great. Sounds good in a strategy document, but how are you actually going to make
how does it support with the customer?
Yeah, that's right. So we've got to come back to that. And, I think Brett's right. An overhaul of performance-based standards, it was revolutionary, world-leading at the time, but they have become prescriptive vehicle in a sense.
We were talking with Les Bruiser about, and he said there's 6,000 ADOLs on the road now.
Yeah.
So that to me, it should be away from a permit and on a notice.
Yep.
It's just a waste of admin time and a lot of operators' time to be messing around with permits for a vehicle there's 6,000 of.
And as you know, it's
a waste of resources.
It is a waste of resources.
And it's back to front because in the good old days, and you would have experienced this, you build the damn thing, but you're unsure whether you're going to get access.
Yeah.
So you've spent $1 million building the thing and designing it, and then find, oh, no, sorry, you can't have the access.
Well, the thing about that, though, Neil, is now, because there is a device called an A-double or a truck and dog or whatever it is, that the innovation around that's relative. It's done.
It's done. Yeah.
I mean, there's no innovation there. So I'd argue, why is this on a permit? Put it on a notice.
Standardise it.
Get it, just standardise and get it on a notice. And that will allow some other innovation to come through.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's what they should be focused on, is what else is innovative in particular industries that can add value.
Yeah.
And as I say, there's one vehicle we put to them that basically is a walk-up start 50% increase.
Yep.
And we're still waiting.
Oh, well, we've been told no.
Yeah.
No's the answer to that, but
but there's a lot of no's before
I don't take no very well.
There's a lot of no's before a yes, so we're still waiting. But just an example on the rail side of things, because we're not anti-rail. It just needs to work. And the reality with rail is that you need to fill the bastard. Excuse the language, but you need to fill all the carriages.
Oh, there's issues with rail in terms of you need a long lead too. These short lead rails is a response to congestion.
Yeah,
and that doesn't reduce costs per se.
No,
it may, but I suspect it doesn't. When you add it up, it doesn't.
No, I was just going to use an example.
Long leads are what work for rail.
Yep,
200 plus leads. And
the reality of port logistics is you're not always fortunate to have those long leads.
No.
Shipping lines don't want to have their containers tied up. The
trade window
sitting around
for
an
vessel
extended
cut off.
And
like we had
miss by 2, you miss by 80.
Yeah, it's massive.
Yeah.
So we had a customer yesterday packing out west.
Yes.
And the supply chain is quite detailed on their side of things, and the end result was we were chasing 2 boxes. They finished packing the 2 boxes this morning, 5:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, and the cut-off is 12 o'clock today.
Yep.
So the beauty is we can go from the customer to our depot down to Brisbane, lodge it in the terminal. Again, the beauty is, a large portion of the terminals are 24-hour. That's great. We operate 24-hour, and we minute this down to 1 truck, 2 containers, rather than a train that has to wait for, it's loaded for X amount and it's waiting for the last 2.
And in the bad old days, and it still does exist, you have conversations with governments around, it's not a road versus rail argument.
No.
You need both.
One's got to support another.
And exactly that, Nathan. What you just said is right. Sometimes you need a high productivity freight vehicle to take it from the intermodal terminal and take it directly to the ship because of the cut-off. It's not so. And if you're not allowing access for high productivity freight vehicles in and out of intermodal terminals because you're trying to protect the rail, it doesn't work.
Nonsense.
Yeah, because then it's just, it also means that the service levels for the stevedore are lumpy because they're waiting for, potentially last minute a train. And ultimately, you can't hold up a vessel.
No.
We need to make sure that we keep turning those.
No, and that's been, I think that's been one of the issues with rail, has been that they haven't had small and nimbler operators operating the rail services. So they've had larger companies that have been less focused on their customers. They just want to cart one thing, coal, let's face it, coal, iron ore, whatever it might be, one bulk commodity. When you've got a whole bunch of different customers and different products in containers, that's a whole different mindset in terms of how that rail runs.
And I like to look at it, again, coming back to the workshops we run, I try to drill into people that every time you touch the container, it costs you $30 to $50.
That's it.
Yep. So it's all about handling, and unless you design your rail service appropriately, which they've now done, say, in Sydney with, say, Patrick's automated rail handling within the terminal, you're going to touch the box multiple times. So that's time delay, that's additional cost.
And the shorter you lead, the more cost there is loaded into that.
Correct. So you've got to try and overcome those natural disadvantages, if I can term it that way, for rail. And, the other component of it is, and that's why I think, for example, in the future, things like Moorebank in New South Wales will work because the customer, the beneficial cargo owner, is right there. They don't care if it's coming out second, third, fourth day of availability for the import because they're not having to take it away from the intermodal terminal area. Shorten the freight miles.
Yep.
And that overcomes the disadvantages.
That can be quite efficient when you do it that way. When you're centered around that rail hub. Yeah.
But I will say, for example, one of our alliance companies in Sydney, Swift, has taken over the rail operation in Enfield, and they're making it work because they are road transport operators, and they say, quite simply to me, it's just a big truck now.
Yeah.
It's got, a prime mover on the front. Yes, it's got 80 containers on it, not 2 or 3 or 4, but it's a truck. It's got a metre window, a vehicle booking window at the port, and we dispatched it, so that they don't get caught up in any sort of rail gunzel type of, this is something different.
No, that's good. But it's that customer focus.
Yeah, it's a customer focus, and they'll interchange that with road transport where they need to meet customer demand. So it's all comes back to the freight task and what the customer wants.
That's good. All right. Well, let's wrap it up with one final question that I have. I've got 2 questions, but we'll go one for one around. Given that Neil's the guest, I'll go first, you go second.
The mystery
throw me last. So I want you guys to scan your eyes, your mind's eyes, 10 years down the track. And two-fold question. First one is, what's one thing you're really excited and optimistic about in
retirement, Nathan?
Stop it. You're not that old. And then the second one is, what's one thing you're concerned about? So I'll kick off first. My excited, optimistic thing. I'm excited and optimistic for autonomous vehicles. From the perspective of, this is not about losing jobs. The reality is we have a driver shortage, labour issue.
Yes.
And we also have an economic forecast of growth. And so there's a clear challenge right now.
Yeah.
Then there's also the factor of if you can get your pricing right, being competitive with pricing and keeping costs down as well. So I'm quite excited about various elements, not the entire element, but various elements of autonomous vehicles, within the next 10 years. What's your one, Brett?
Similar, Nathan, but it's about AI and the impact AI will have on the task, the logistics task. So, what part of it can we automate with smarts?
Yep.
We've gone a fair ways there, but there's a lot more, and you're right at the end there, where the actual delivery is done by an automated device that uses AI to negotiate to get there.
Yep.
But there's a whole bunch of stuff in the middle that I'm excited about. I think in the next 10 years, we will see automated vehicles. I agree. We'll probably see them in controlled environments.
Yep.
Like the port.
Yep. That'll make sense.
That makes lots of sense in mining operations as well. We're seeing that now. But the use of AI to, better schedule, better control, better identify.
Which all supports the customer.
And keeps costs in check. Yeah.
Yep. Nice.
So if you've got children, get them into coding. I think is because that's where the future is, into IT. I think that autonomous vehicles, but I would come back to, well, here's a question. I'll answer a question with a question. Do you think your drivers are just behind the wheel going from point A to point B, or do they have a role in customer relationships? And will an autonomous vehicle actually deliver on that?
Interesting.
Will you still need the driver or someone or some technology?
Yes.
Which is satisfying your customers' needs. Look, how many times does your driver problem solve when they reach the destination?
On site, yeah. And that can be, I can imagine a situation where a large customer site, you might do 10 or 15 boxes a day to, that there is a person there who maybe backs them up against the wall, against a delivery dock or whatever, receives the automated vehicle, jumps in, deals with it.
Yeah.
So that it's point to point, the simple stuff.
What I'm excited about though, Nathan, is that container logistics is always going to grow.
Yeah.
So it's a fantastic opportunity for people to be in an industry. And again, you guys do it well in terms of recruitment and training your people up. But, we all, woe is me, we have a skill shortage, we have a people shortage. I just think there's a lot we could do to sell this industry. Containers are sexy. Come on. Let's go. What can we do to attract more women into driving tasks before the automation comes along? How can we get people switched on to, being part of this industry? And the world's your oyster. There's a whole range of things from management right down to operations that should excite people.
100%. And just, on the female participation side of things, we were at a meeting yesterday, and when it got to the Q&A side of things, there was a female in the audience, and she was the most vocal. And everything that she asked and everything she responded with and her contribution was just A1. And I was just thinking, go girl, this is awesome. Yeah. This is awesome that, and particularly this is in a heavy haulage environment, which is, typically a blokey type, place. But here she was
and not that old.
And not that old, she'd be in her 20s, so it was fantastic.
Yeah, and as you guys said in one of your podcasts on your electric vehicle, it's quieter, it's more user friendly in that regard. All those things.
Big car now.
All those things will change the environment for people's enjoyment of what they do. So we really should be coming together as an industry to try and sort of work through all of that. Try to overcome some of the, I would call just petty, bureaucratic nature of some of the regulation around licensing and those sorts of things, and really get into, what can we do? And it's all hard graft. You're going to try to make a case for why would you come into this industry compared to the IT industry or the finance industry or some other industry, and sell it on the basis that, Mr. McLean was right. It's going to grow. Yeah,
most certainly. So our final question, let's rip through this, is what's one thing you're concerned about that, if it doesn't change, it may be detrimental to the industry? And the comment I was going to make here is I totally recognise that terminals are very expensive. They're very expensive to run and operate. The one thing I think we should be mindful of is just the cost balance.
Yep.
That if that conversation is not managed effectively in the years to come, what does it look like for ultimately the customer? And this is not about trying to take profits away from certain entities. It's really about where do these conversations lie, and on what side do these charges make more sense to be on. I just don't want to see it get to a point where it's unreasonable. Because in some cases we're seeing things where these third-party charges are actually more expensive than the freight task.
Absolutely.
And to the eyes of the shipper, you look at that and go, well, this doesn't make sense. So, again, this is not to take away from the fact that there's a massive investment that these stevedores have.
Ultimately, Nath, what will happen is it'll get back to regulation, and we don't want regulation.
We don't want that.
Because that'll stifle innovation and stifle productivity.
Yep, and stifle the conversation and the collaboration.
Yeah. We don't. I think that's be a bad outcome for the industry if the stevedores are subject to regulation.
The worst case scenario, as the freight task grows, which it will, the worst case scenario is people retreat into their silos, and just what's good for my business, stuff everybody else.
Yep.
Which can happen, So it can happen with stevedoring. They're all about velocity through the terminal. They don't want the export in if the vessel's been pushed back in terms of berthing schedule. You have to hold that out. That costs you and your customer more money. They want you to get the box as quickly as possible from discharge. They're not going to give you any more days, even as the freight task grows. So you can understand their behavioural mentality around that. It's all about velocity. You talk to Matt Hollenby, who's fantastic, from Patrick. It's a production line. They want to move the boxes in, move the boxes out. The shipping lines want to get their vessels in, get their vessels out. Do they care that you might spend 4 hours trying to get into the terminal to pick your box up? No. So if you maintain that siloed mentality, we won't work together to solve issues. And I'm not just being, I think there's got to be a commercial imperative to the whole thing, but if as the freight task grows, everybody just, retreats back into their bunker, they're in trouble.
No, it's not good.
And transport operators are as we said, the piggy and the mini in the middle. You're the ones that suffer.
Yep. And that sort of complements one of the discussions we've had on previous episodes about, there's the velocity from the shipping line, there's the velocity from the stevedore. Road transport attempts to have the velocity, and where sometimes the obstruction comes is limited operational hours at customer sites.
That's right.
And that can slow down the velocity movement of that entire supply chain.
And again, coming back to discussions with governments around freight policy, freight, initiatives, those sorts of things roll off their tongue all the time. Oh, the rest of the chain's got to go 24/7. Well, it's lovely to put in a policy document. How are you actually going to make that happen? Do you actually know what's driving your customers' behaviour? Yeah, sometimes it can be local government restrictions on noise. I mean, so, let's break it down and let's have the proper conversations about how do you smooth out the operation of the whole supply chain instead of just writing some, paragraph in a policy document somewhere. And then leaving it to the likes of you guys to try and talk to your customer about, well, can we have the keys to the yard and we'll drop it out with a side lifter?
Yep.
And then we can give you a discount on that as a result. Those sorts of things have got to go on. But government's got to understand it and provide some initiatives as well.
Yep. All right. Anything you want to add to?
My biggest concern is global warming.
Yep.
I think that's a real issue for the ongoing growth of our industry, and potentially change customer behaviour too down the track. When my children come through and are they consuming stuff now, I think they're very cognizant of their footprint, how much they buy, sort of stuff they buy, whether indeed they indeed own a car. So I think that's a potential constraint on the industry going forward, is that the consumer behaviour will change, I suspect, and be more climate friendly.
And our sector of the industry, as we said before, is really hard to rebate the the emissions. You know, it's a difficult sector to deal with. As we said, 2030, 97% of the vehicles on the road will still be diesel.
Yep.
So
we've got to do it more efficiently, Neil. That's the first thing we've got to do, so that our total fuel burn, even though the volumes are going up, comes off.
Yep.
And then we look at other ways like electric and maybe hydrogen, a few things to try and reduce that footprint.
And again, it's hard, but and I presume you do it in your business, but things like eco driving and tyre pressures and all of these things, aerodynamics of the vehicle, they all count.
Yep.
I've seen figures of if you're teaching even experienced drivers how to drive more efficiently, you can save up to 10 to 15% of fuel cost.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is big.
Yeah.
You can translate that into emissions.
Yeah. Which and also keeping your fleet young as well. Also, the newer trucks tend to have lower litres per kilometre.
Yeah.
In terms of burn. So that's important. But you get back to you can't get away from, if I can cart 2 boxes rather than 1 to the job.
Yeah.
That's going to be a lower cents per K for that delivered product.
My wife hates me at cafes because if the van pulls up to deliver something and keeps the engine idling, I'm going,
switch it off.
Don't ask them. Just go switch it off.
That's it.
Yeah, nice. And anything from you, Neil, that you want to add as anything you're concerned about over the next 10 years, if it wasn't to change?
I think it's just where I might be retired, Nathan, and what beach I might be on.
Yeah.
No, it's look. I'm a half glass full type of guy, really, more so than a half glass empty. I think the future is bright. I think Brett's right. Technology can deliver a lot for us, but I'm just concerned that if we don't have collaboration across, again, as we said, what is a very complex supply chain, if we don't have that collaboration and we don't have governments understanding, what's driving all of that behaviour, and then we might be in a muddle. So, but it's up to us. It's up to us to get that information out to governments, get those conversations going.
Yes.
Yep.
Which we've been successful to a degree with. And finishing on a positive note, Nathan, as we said, here in the Port of Brisbane, it's a pretty good community.
It's amazing.
It's and it's a fantastic, facility. It's all within a confined area, and some really fantastic natural advantages. We shouldn't lose sight of that.
And automation was trialled here.
Yeah,
and it's been very successful here. So
yep. Absolutely, absolutely, and can grow. Yeah. We can do anything as humans, really, if we put our mind to it.
Yep. We've proved that. Well, let's wrap it up there, because Francis showed me his hand signals about 20 times. So I think that this is our longest episode so far. So thank you, Neil, for joining us. And I just want to finish in closing by saying, genuinely thank you for the advocacy you do for this industry. I know that some people may not like what they have to read sometimes, but the reality is you say it as it is, and sometimes people may not like to hear that, but sometimes they got to hear that.
I get abusive phone calls from time to time from managing directors of various organisations, but that's okay.
And we appreciate you fielding those, because we know that it's coming from a place of, just like we've essenced in this conversation, it's customer focused. We are focused on the importers and exporters in this industry, and you're focused on all the necessary parties in the supply chain on how do we cohesively work together and collaborate. So again, people may not like what you have to say sometimes, but sometimes you need a bit of a slap over the face and a bit of reality
get on with it.
Check as well, and get on with it.
Well, I try not to be too emotive about it, but I try to just put the facts out there.
Yeah.
Some people don't necessarily like the facts. Oh, they might have a different view about what the facts are, but that's okay.
Alternative facts.
Yes, alternative facts. Fake news.
Yeah. But anyway, a great partner to have, mate, and we appreciate you being our very first, guest appearing on our new little venture.
Look, I'm so honoured to be the first guest. That's fantastic. And you guys are a fantastic alliance company. Magnificent.
Cool. Thank you, mate.
Cheers, mate.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to our podcast, Rolling Forward.
We love sharing content for the logistics industry, so please also connect with us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Instagram.